In 1945, the Speer children enjoyed screenings of Mickey Mouse cartoons at the Führer's mountain compound. 2 years later, their father was locked away as a war criminal, and 2 decades would pass before they'd see him again. Yet, here's the startling truth. When Albert Speer finally emerged from prison, the long-awaited family reunion never materialized. Rather than reconnecting with his children, Speer devoted his remaining years to crafting a carefully constructed narrative about his past. Meanwhile, his children embarked on a completely different journey. If these historical revelations intrigue you, subscribe and enable notifications to catch our upcoming explorations of World War II's hidden consequences. The mountain paradise that disappeared. The Berghof represented Nazi Germany's closest approximation to a storybook fortress. Hitler's Alpine headquarters in the Bavarian mountains served as the location where the Führer hosted visitors, developed military plans, and displayed an aura of sophistication. For the Speer family's children, this mountain estate was practically their second residence. Albert Speer held the position of Hitler's preferred architect, the creative mind behind Nuremberg's spectacular Cathedral of Light, who envisioned transforming Berlin into Germania, the crowning capital of what was meant to be a millennium-long empire. His intimate connection to Hitler granted his family extraordinary privileges that most Germans couldn't conceive of. His children viewed American animated features alongside Eva Braun. They rode cable cars up to Kelschheim, the location of Hitler's Eagle's Nest. Decades afterward, Margaret Speer characterized those years as a perfect childhood, a description that today feels deeply troubling. Then, May 1945 arrived. American forces advanced across Germany, and the Speer residence became a military objective. Soldiers confiscated everything of value. The children observed their belongings being stuffed into military bags. Their father, previously one of Europe's most influential figures, had become one of its most hunted men. He turned himself in to Allied authorities and was taken to Nuremberg, where those responsible for the Holocaust would stand trial. For the 6 Speer children, Albert Jr., Hilde, Fritz, Margaret, Arnold, and Ernst, the reversal was complete. In 1 month, they descended from Nazi elite to the family of a defendant facing charges of crimes against humanity. The verdict that altered everything. At Nuremberg, the prosecution sought capital punishment. Albert Speer had supervised the exploitation of millions of enslaved workers throughout German war manufacturing. Laborers from concentration camps, occupied nations, and prisoner of war facilities all flowed into the industrial system Speer controlled. The documentation was overwhelming. Yet Speer adopted a strategy the other accused did not. He displayed regret. He maintained he hadn't understood the complete scope of the Holocaust. He portrayed himself as a technical administrator who had remained oblivious to the atrocities occurring in his vicinity. The tribunal was divided on his credibility. Ultimately, Speer received a 20-year term at Spandau Prison in Berlin, a punishment that seemed merciful compared to the execution awaiting Göring, Ribbentrop, and others. However, for his wife Margarethe, this outcome may have proved worse than widowhood. She now confronted 20 years of single-handedly raising 6 children, bound to a husband who lived yet remained entirely inaccessible, notorious yet foully dishonored. The family moved to Heidel, where they encountered immediate and severe social rejection. Former acquaintances disappeared. Opportunities that once existed now evaporated. Albert Speer's children were condemned through association in a nation desperate to erase its recent history. Financial survival came from an unlikely source. Rudolf Walters, an architect who had collaborated with Speer during wartime, discreetly established what he termed the school fund. Affluent industrialists, men who had profited tremendously from Speer's wartime oversight of armaments manufacturing, made quiet contributions throughout the years. This fund transferred 158,000 Deutsche Marks to the Speer household. It represented conscience money, channeled through hidden networks, sustaining a war criminal's wife and children, while their father marked time in his prison cell. The name that required erasure. The youngest Speer boy entered the world in 1940, at the peak of Nazi authority. His parents christened him Adolf, a name that, at that moment, symbolized devotion, aspiration, and perhaps even expectations that their son might perpetuate aspects of the Führer's ideology. By 1945, that name had become unbearable. The change was administrative, yet devastating. His parents formally altered his name to Arnold. One document, one signature, and the most obvious marker of the family's Nazi connections vanished from official documentation. But renaming cannot erase recollection. Arnold matured knowing he'd been born Adolf, understanding his parents had selected that name intentionally, comprehending what it revealed about their former selves. This solitary action, changing a child's identity, took something abstract and rendered it painfully tangible. The Speer children weren't merely coping with an imprisoned father. They were confronting the daily burden of carrying a legacy they hadn't selected and couldn't shed. Growing up marked, Hilde, the oldest daughter, discovered early what bearing her father's surname meant in the post-war era. As a teenager, she requested a visa to enter the United States. The application was rejected, specifically and explicitly, because her father was a convicted war criminal. The denial generated international headlines. Here was a young woman barely past childhood when hostilities ceased, being held accountable for offenses she hadn't committed. Eventually, authorities reversed the decision, but the harm was irreversible. Hilde grasped something her siblings would all eventually learn through their own experiences. The world would never perceive them as individuals first. They would eternally be Albert Speer's offspring. The question that tormented them had no resolution. Were they guilty through heredity? Could they ever be viewed as distinct from their father's wrongdoings? Different siblings would ultimately reach vastly different answers. Letters through prison barriers. Throughout 20 years, the sole link between Albert Speer and his children existed through correspondence. Official letters, extensively scrutinized by prison officials, arrived sporadically. Yet Speer discovered another method. A compassionate Dutch guard named Tony Proust became his clandestine messenger, smuggling communications past Spandau's security. Through these channels, Speer attempted to maintain his paternal role from behind bars. He wrote about their schooling, their prospects, his aspirations for their lives. The children matured with a father who existed solely as written words on paper, a voice lacking a face, a presence without physical form. Then, October 1st, 1966 arrived. Speer had completed every day of his 2-decade sentence. Spandau's gates swung open, and he stepped into a world that had transformed entirely during his confinement. His children, who had been small when he departed, were now grown. Some had married, some had children themselves. The reunion, imagined for 20 years, was finally achievable. What transpired next would shatter any possibility of family healing and turn his children against everything he represented. The myth builder, Albert Speer, exited Spandau Prison and entered a waiting luxury vehicle. Media personnel surrounded him. Publishing houses had been pursuing him for years, eager for his autobiography. Within months, he was crafting what would become Inside the Third Reich, a book destined to sell millions of copies globally and establish him as the good Nazi, the one who supposedly hadn't truly understood, the technocrat who'd been caught up in circumstances beyond his comprehension. His children observed their father selecting celebrity over kinship. Rather than reconstructing the relationships frozen for 20 years, Speer plunged into constructing what his daughter Margaret would later term the Speer myth. He granted interviews, he consulted with scholars, he accumulated wealth from publishing royalties and lecture circuits, all while maintaining his central assertion that he hadn't known about the Holocaust. The children anticipated a homecoming. Instead, they encountered a stranger who appeared more invested in restoring his public reputation than in reconnecting with the people who'd grown up in his absence. Hilde expressed it directly in subsequent interviews. One by one, my sisters and brothers abandoned hope. She stated, there was no real communication. The man who emerged from Spandau wasn't the father they'd hoped for. He was a public personality, performing contrition for audiences while providing little to his own family. The architect who rejected his father's legacy. Yet one Speer child discovered an alternative route through the ruins of his inheritance. Albert Speer Jr. became one of Germany's most acclaimed architects of his era. He designed the primary thoroughfare for the 2008 Beijing Olympics. He developed the comprehensive blueprint for Expo 2000 in Hanover. His designs received recognition, transformed urban landscapes, and earned the kind of architectural legacy his father had always desired but never attained. The contradiction cut profoundly. Albert Jr. succeeded at precisely what his father had failed to accomplish, creating structures that would endure and be remembered. He achieved this while deliberately separating himself from his father's shadow. In interviews, he acknowledged he'd spent his entire life attempting to distinguish himself from his father. The son constructed what the father only imagined, and he built it upon a foundation of denial. Whatever abilities he inherited, Whatever insights he absorbed from a father devoted to architecture, he utilized them while distancing himself from the man who provided them. The daughter who transformed disgrace into purpose. Hilde adopted an even more dramatic response to her inheritance. She didn't merely distance herself from her father's past, she actively opposed everything he'd symbolized. She entered politics with Germany's Green Party, dedicating her career to environmental protection and social equity. In 1994, she received the Moses Mendelssohn Award for her efforts combating anti-Semitism in Germany. The daughter of Hitler's architect, recognized by a Jewish organization for fighting the bigotry her father's regime had institutionalized. In 1968, amid the turbulence of student movements, Hilde established a communal living space in Berlin. Decades later, that same community welcomed Syrian refugees, a direct connection between her rejection of Nazi ideology and practical action embracing the displaced and persecuted. The shame that once resulted in her visa denial became the driving force of her work. She converted inherited culpability into active restoration. But one daughter did something even more remarkable with her inheritance, something that would have appalled her father. The paintings that supported Jewish creativity. Margaret Speer inherited multiple paintings from her father's art collection. These weren't ordinary artworks. Considering how her father had accumulated wealth and power during the Nazi period, there existed a genuine likelihood that some pieces were stolen, seized from Jewish households, removed from museums in conquered territories, obtained through the apparatus of persecution. Margaret confronted a decision. She could retain the paintings, appreciate them privately, and sidestep difficult questions. She could sell them discreetly and keep the profits. Or she could pursue an entirely different path. She liquidated the collection and directed the proceeds toward establishing a foundation supporting Jewish women's artistic endeavors in Germany. The daughter of Hitler's architect, using artwork potentially stolen from Jewish families to finance Jewish artists creating new work in a nation that had attempted to annihilate them. The narrative arc was unmistakable. Inherited guilt transformed into active restoration. A legacy of theft redirected toward creation. The shadows that remained. When Albert Speer died in London on September 1st, 1981, he was financially comfortable from book earnings and speaking engagements. He had successfully persuaded much of the public that he was the Nazi who hadn't truly comprehended the horror, the decent German who'd been swept into something terrible but hadn't participated in its worst aspects. His children understood otherwise. In 1971, Speer composed a letter to a Holocaust survivor, admitting he'd visited the Mauthausen concentration camp and attended Himmler's notorious Posen speech, the 1943 address where Himmler explicitly outlined the extermination of Jewish people. The letter verified what Nuremberg prosecutors had suspected. Speer had known. He'd always known. Whether his children ever saw that correspondence remains uncertain. What's indisputable is that the family never reconciled. Fritz, the middle son, left virtually no public trace of his existence, a silence that reveals his determination to vanish from history. The other children dispersed globally: Baghdad, Chicago, Berlin, Frankfurt, building lives distant from their father's influence. The prison walls fell on October 1st, 1966, but the emotional barriers never crumbled. 20 years of separation, followed by 15 years of myth-making, left no foundation for family reconstruction. What the children became, the Speer children's reactions to their inheritance varied dramatically. Unlike Emmy Goring, who defended her husband until her death, or the Bormann family who chose complete silence, the Speer children primarily chose active repudiation. Albert Jr. fulfilled his father's professional ambitions while denouncing his father's choices. Hilde transformed disgrace into advocacy, receiving recognition for combating the anti-Semitism the regime had codified. Margaret financed Jewish artists using Nazi-era artwork. The others retreated into obscurity, avoiding interviews, refusing to become supporting characters in the father's continuing story. Their common thread was this: their father's freedom produced no family restoration. He walked out of Spandau and immediately began performing remorse for global audiences, while offering virtually nothing to the children who'd waited 20 years for his return. In the final analysis, Albert Speer obtained what he wanted: a position in history as something beyond the simple villain. His memoirs sold millions. Historians debated his assertions for decades. He became the Nazi who might have been different, the one who voiced regret. But his children saw through the performance. They watched him choose public redemption over private reconciliation. and individually, they constructed lives that rejected everything he embodied, converting inherited guilt into something their father never achieved: genuine atonement. Thank you for watching. If you found this exploration meaningful, explore our other investigations into the post-war fates of Nazi leaders' families. Please like this video, subscribe, and enable notifications so you won't miss our next release.